Romans 3 says that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Romans 3 says there is none righteous, no, not one. Romans 6:23 says the wages of that sin then is death. The very truth that this body I possess will one day rot in the grave and speak and hear and breathe no more this side of eternity is proof that sin has passed upon all men. Death is the ultimate proof that sin has passed on all men, because you know the reality of it. I know the reality of all of us die. Death is real. All of us have experienced someone, a friend or a family, that has tasted of death. And there is nothing at all pleasant about that enemy, death. The Bible calls death an enemy. There's nothing pleasant about it. I do not love funerals. I love weddings. As a pastor, I love it when people get married in the church. But that's the responsibilities that I have as a pastor, is to marry and bury. Both. And every funeral that I have done, every time I've been to a funeral, there has been this sinking feeling. Even if there's joy that I know where the person is, there's this sinking feeling that death is going to pass upon all of us. And death is going to take me one day. And death is going to take my wife one day. In fact, it's not guaranteed that my children will outlive me. Death may take them even into young age, in their toddler stages. Death is a reality that is there. That is not good news, but it's true. And the very fact that death is passed upon all is evidence that sin is passed upon all. Because the wages of sin is that death. The only certainties of life are death and taxes. That's what Benjamin Franklin said. And I think he spoke with wisdom, especially around tax time here. But when my death day comes, I pay taxes every day, I have a tax day. When my death day comes, I will not be getting a refund. Only one life will soon be passed. Only what's done for Christ will last. You're no different than I. You too will face death, since all are sinners and all will die. Solomon said it's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of gladness, because then you get a real picture of life. All are sinners, all will die, death will pass upon all. You cannot, I cannot cheat death. But what's more penetrating than the reality that death will pass upon all of us because we are under the condemnation of God is that Hebrews tells us that after death, that it is appointed unto man once to die, and after that, judgment. You see, we will stand before a holy God after death. The truth. We are sinners, and therefore, we are terminal. That is the reality. But where did this sin come from? How did this happen? Verse 12 tells us that by one man sin entered the world. Verse 15 says, there was an offense of one. By the offense of one, many be dead. Verse 16 says, and it was not as it was by one that sinned. Verse 17 says, for if by one man's offense death reigned, by one. Verse 18 says, therefore as by the offense of one, judgment came upon all. Verse 19 says, for as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners. Do you think that the author here is trying to get at a point? Almost every verse brings this out. By one's disobedience, by the sin of one, it affected all. To understand this, we have to go back to the book of Genesis to see who this one was. Genesis chapter 3 is where we have to go back. I'm going to look at Genesis chapter 3 a little bit this morning and then come back to Romans 5. In Genesis chapter 3, I'm not going to read this passage. Instead, I want you to look at it as I go through it and kind of paraphrase for time's sake. In Genesis 3, Satan, who is the serpent being described here in verse 1, now the serpent was more subtle or deceitful than any beast of the field. Satan takes the form of a serpent here. He's talked about being the serpent in Revelation. He was the serpent now, but after being created by God, was an anointed angel whose purpose was the glory and praise of God. Different Old Testament books tell us that Satan, who was Lucifer at that time, he fell from his exalted state of worship and adoration of God due to pride and a desire and desired to exalt himself above the Most High, and arrogance that was in him. He comes to Eve here in Genesis chapter 3. Eve, of course, you know, if you've heard anything about the Bible, Eve was the first woman created. She was created from Adam. Adam was the first man. He comes to Eve, and he tempts her to disobey God's command. God had given a command that out of all the trees of the garden they may freely eat, but of one tree we're not to eat of it. And he said, you're not to eat of it because in the day you eat of it, you will die. But God had not told them, okay, I don't want you to eat this one tree. Instead, he had said, look at all these trees you can have. Just don't eat this one. God had emphasized the bounty he had given them and said, but there's one exception. I don't know why God did that one exception. I have no idea. I have a speculation that God was testing them like he tests every one of us to see if they truly were obedient. But the serpent quotes the very words of God. But whereas God had given a command that they were not to eat of the so-called forbidden fruit, whatever it was, I highly doubt it was an apple, because nobody would spoil the beauty of the garden of God and sell their soul for an apple. I don't know who would do that. Maybe a little caramel dipped in it, but not by itself. God had given them a command they were not to eat of this forbidden fruit, but the devil posed it as a question. You see, God gave the command, the devil made it a question. He says in verse 3, hath God said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And you notice what else he left out? He left out the fact that God had said they could eat of every tree of the garden but one. He focused in on the one negative. He focused in on that one little thing. And he says, has God said you can't eat of the tree? Has God told you not to do something? Is God trying to hold something back from you? And he comes in his subtlety and his craftiness, and he says, it's not enough what God has given you. It's not enough. There's something you're missing. Has God not restricted you and holds you down? Do you not desire to be free from the restraints of God's schemes? The woman answers the devil in verse 2, basically saying, yeah, God did say that. He said we may eat of all trees, of every tree of the garden, but of the one we can't eat. If we do, and she says, neither touch it, if we do, we're going to die. Verse 4, Satan comes at a little different tactic, and he says, ye shall not surely die. God's lying to you. First, he questions whether or not God was being bountiful, God was being gracious, God was being good. God's not good. He's trying to restrict you. And then he says, and God's lying to you. He's not telling you the truth. He's got some other ulterior motive. The deceiver tells flat-out lies today as well. You will not get caught. No one will know but you. And in the quiet dark, people believe the lie of Satan, and sin and disobedience does not have consequences, or at least palpable consequences. You can handle them. You can take it. And now the serpent boldly proclaims that God is a liar. He first causes her to question God's authority, and then he leads her to doubt God's reliability. And now he makes a full frontal attack in verse 5, a full frontal attack on truth, and challenges her to deny God's sincerity. He says here, for God doth know that in the day you eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. So he first causes her to question God's authority. Is God really telling you this? Then he causes her to doubt God's reliability. God can't be trusted. You're not going to die. And then he challenges her to deny God's sincerity. God's really trying to hurt you. He's trying to cause damage upon you. He's not trying to protect you. In fact, the claim of Satan here is that God is afraid of them. He reverses the roles. Do you see that? He reverses it. Instead of they need to be fearing God, he encourages them and says, God needs to fear you. You see, God needs to fear you because you can make good choices. You have a mind. You have an intellect. You have a will. And God is trying to restrict you. He is not authoritative in what he says to you. He is not reliable, and he is not sincere. God is for the weak. He is a crutch. You don't need God. You don't need his commands. God needs you. That's really what he is saying here. He's saying God needs you.